U.S. President Donald Trump has announced a 35% tariff on Canadian goods to go into effect on August 1st.
Montana farmers are voicing frustrations over the Trump administration's use of tariffs.
Tariffs are having a real impact right here in the Treasure State, with farmers and ranchers feeling it firsthand.
Since the start of August 2025, Washington had been intent on shifting the rules of trade. But Canada was not willing to play along. In Ottawa, Parliament members shut down talks decisively. American farmers, meanwhile, were left staring at empty barns and wondering who would buy their milk. The message from the White House was clear. Trade terms would be reset in a way that benefited the United States, no matter the cost. But this time, Canada refused to yield. Instead of bowing its head, Ottawa stood firm, defending farmers, workers, and domestic industries. Negotiations froze. Border crossings grew quiet. Export contracts were delayed or canceled. Americans who had long relied on a constant flow of cross-border trade suddenly faced mounting stockpiles with no buyers. In rural communities where livelihoods had depended on dairy exports to Canada, fresh milk quickly became an unwanted burden. Meanwhile, Canadian farmers closed ranks, backed by government support to protect their domestic market and expand beyond the United States. This was not just a trade tug-of-war, it was a declaration. Canada would not be pushed into weakness. Instead of giving in, Ottawa began to redefine Canada's place in North America's supply chain, driven by unity and determination.
The vast majority of Canadian exports to the United States are not tariffed and won't be tariffed at this new higher rate. Canada's been able to carve out an exemption for any goods that are compliant under the Canada-US-Mexico free trade deal. The Bank of Canada found 95% of Canadian exports are exempt, and if you add up all of the exports to the United States, including all those exemptions, Canadian producers are only actually paying somewhere between 2.3% and 5% on average.
So Trump looked elsewhere. He chose a battleground few expected: dairy. To Washington, Canada's system of supply controls and support for its dairy sector was a symbol of imbalance in trade. But in Ottawa, dairy was more than a commodity. It was a livelihood for thousands of families, a pillar of rural communities, and part of national identity. Americans saw supply management as a wall that blocked free trade. Canadians saw it as protection, stability against overproduction, fair income for farmers, and a guarantee of balance. So when Trump used dairy as leverage, Ottawa saw it as a red line. This was not just economics, it was sovereignty. Who decides the future of Canadian agriculture, Washington or Canada itself? Ottawa chose to stand firm. The message was simple. If anyone believed Canada could be forced into submission by attacking what mattered most to its people, they had chosen the wrong fight.
Prime Minister Mark Carney says he's disappointed by Trump's decision, saying on X, "We will continue to negotiate with the United States on our trading relationship. The Canadian government is laser-focused on what we can control, building Canada strong." Experts believe these new tariffs are being used as a negotiation tactic to strike a deal with Canada.
This was never just about cartons of milk. It was about the direction of trade between two nations bound by geography but divided by policy. Tensions grew sharper. Industry braced for the fallout. Everyone watched to see which side would break first.
President Trump just told a pretty big lie about Canadian dairy tariffs.
They do the first little carton of milk at a very low price, but after that it gets bad, and then it gets up to 275, 300%.
Nope, it's not just one little carton. Under the USMCA that Trump's own first administration negotiated, Canada guaranteed that tens of thousands of metric tons per year of U.S. milk imports would be tariff-free. So not low tariffs, zero tariffs. And here's something else Trump didn't mention. The U.S. currently isn't even at half of that tariff-free maximum level. So those high Canadian tariffs that apply above the maximum aren't currently in effect.
For U.S. farmers, long plagued by unstable prices and overproduction, Trump's move looked like a possible lifeline. Maybe it could stabilize income and bring relief. For Canadian farmers, supply management was survival itself, shielding them from volatility, preserving the value of labor, and protecting entire communities. Two nations, two perspectives, worlds apart.
In Canada, we find that they're charging us over 200% for dairy products. You know about that. And when I left, we had that well taken care of, but under Biden, they just kept raising it. Very difficult to deal with, the Canadian.
Amid rising tensions, one question lingered. Would Trump's tariffs break Canada's resolve, or would U.S. farmers pay the price?
Now, there are some major problems with Donald Trump's figures, including the fact no one pays those tariffs. They only kick in on products like milk, cheese, and yogurt at a certain threshold. Below that, there are zero tariffs. And the threshold hasn't been hit yet. But having Trump and his administration complain over and over about Canadian dairy.
For over 60 years, that system had formed the backbone of Canadian dairy. Strict domestic production limits, caps on imports, and steep tariffs. 241% on milk, nearly 400% on butter. Not by accident, but by design, to stabilize prices, sustain incomes, and shield small farms from being destroyed by global competition. Unlike the U.S., where megadairies dominate, Canada's farms were mostly small and family-run, with broad political backing across the country. Few in Canada, whether in government or opposition, questioned the system's importance. Just before Trump raised tariffs again, Canada's parliament passed a law forbidding any future government from using supply management as a bargaining chip. Dairy was no longer just policy. It was locked in as part of Canada's national identity. South of the border, the picture looked very different. U.S. producers generated far more milk than the domestic market could absorb. Oversupply dragged prices down, debts rose, and many farms neared collapse. Exports were not optional. They were a lifeline. Canada, close and wealthy, seemed like the perfect outlet. But supply management kept the door mostly closed. Even so, U.S. companies still sold over $800 million in dairy into Canada annually, while Canadian exports to the U.S. were capped at just $300 million. To American farmers, this imbalance felt like daily proof of lost opportunity. Trump seized on that frustration. In Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, he called supply management an insult and vowed to tear down barriers. Yet even if Canada opened wider, U.S. farmers would still face global competition and crushing costs. Canada's market, while valuable, could not solve America's structural surplus. But for desperate farmers, even a sliver of hope was worth clinging to. By August 2025, Trump's patience was gone. He went all in. When negotiations froze, tariffs rose again, 25% to 35%. On paper, dairy wasn't directly named. Politically, everyone knew it was the target. Trump's tactic was to strike hard and fast. It had worked on Japan, South Korea, even parts of the EU. But Canada was different. Weeks earlier, Parliament had passed the law protecting supply management permanently. It was a rare moment of unity across party lines. Ottawa would not be divided. For Trump, the calculation was simple: force Canada into retreat. But Ottawa's response was defiance. For Canadians, this wasn't just economics. It was about national values, rural survival, and cultural pride. Prime Minister Carney declared Canada would rather walk away from trade talks entirely than compromise on dairy. Instead of breaking Ottawa, Trump had triggered a prolonged standoff that spread far beyond agriculture, into steel, aluminum, and automobiles. Detroit felt the shock. Tariffs on Canadian materials surged to 50%. Within a quarter, GM lost $1 billion, Stellantis $2.7 billion. Ford struggled in silence, but few doubted the damage. At first, automakers promised the storm would pass, but the supply chain was stretched thin. Every car in Michigan relied on Canadian parts. With each hike, costs climbed. Buyers began paying thousands more. Analysts warned, if tariffs stayed, auto industry losses could reach $108 billion in a single year. A fight that began with milk had grown into a threat to America's backbone industry. In Detroit, the question wasn't if tariffs would hurt, but whether the sector could survive 3 more years of this. Ottawa, meanwhile, was ready. Carney chose not to retaliate in kind, but to restructure. Dairy was off the table. It was sacred. Instead, Canada leaned on strengths, energy, minerals, and its vital role in auto supply chains. Trade deals with Europe and Asia expanded. Domestically, support packages kept industries afloat. Canada moved quickly to secure long-term partners abroad. The message was unmistakable. If Trump wanted a fight, Ottawa was prepared to fight on its own terms. The dairy clash was only the beginning. Trump's strategy, apply maximum pressure, demand concessions, depended on opponents folding. Some nations had. But Canada's refusal revealed the limits of the tactic. Tariffs could intimidate smaller, less integrated economies. But against Canada, woven tightly into U.S. supply chains, the blowback was severe. Auto plants, farms, and consumers in the U.S. bore the costs. Canada shielded itself with global partners. Rivals like China stepped into the gaps, expanding influence in energy and minerals, while the U.S. quarreled with its neighbor. The dispute that began over milk had become a test of America's trade doctrine. Could countries be forced into submission? Canada's answer was clear. No. What started with milk had grown into something much larger. Tariffs meant to bend Canada instead ricocheted back onto the United States, into assembly lines, cornfields, and grocery carts. Canada stood firm, protecting its system and forging new paths. American farmers, meanwhile, sat with unsold goods. Automakers counted losses. Families faced higher costs. The paradox was stark. Trump's pressure hurt the United States more than Canada. The question was no longer whether Canada could endure, but whether America, from farms to factories, could withstand a trade war that began with nothing more than a glass of milk.